Hello, everyone. Welcome. We will be starting very shortly. All right. Well, we would like to welcome all of you. Thank you for spending your noon hour with us today. Um, as you may be aware, Santa Clara County has a community plan to end homelessness, which serves as our roadmap for shared strategies and collective action to end and prevent homelessness. Annually, we gather to review our progress and insights gained from this process. Um, but before we go further, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Claudine Cipilli. I work here at Destination Home. Um, the purpose of this webinar is to help folks understand the work that is being done, as well as the opportunities and challenges that are ahead of us. We would like you to know that we are recording this session. As your questions come up, please drop them into the chat. Yes, and here's a slide. So at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you see the chat button there. We get to the next slide, please. All right, so this is our agenda for today. We will start out with a brief overview of the latest community plan progress. That'll be followed by a presentation providing a closer look at temporary housing and shelter in Santa Clara County. Afterwards, we will transition into a panel conversation where we will hear from local leaders sharing their perspectives. And finally, we will open up the discussion for questions from the audience. And again, reminder to please enter your questions into the chat. You can find that at the bottom right corner of your screen. All right, next slide, please. All right. So we just released the latest data on our community plan to end homelessness this week. We will put some of these links that you see on the slide into the chat so you can learn more if you'd like. Next slide, please. So two key trends were revealed. As you can see here on this slide, we saw that in 2023 was the biggest single year I'm sorry. We saw that 2023 was the biggest single year for housing placements ever. As you can see here, almost 4,500 people were housed. That's a 29% increase from 2022. However, we also saw a troubling 24% increase in people becoming homeless. Can we go to the next slide? This is another indication that the root causes of homelessness, such as housing availability, affordability, and wage gaps, remain significant challenges. And there's still much work to be done to address this issue. It will require us finding ways to further expand successful strategies outlined in our community plan, which includes simultaneous investments in housing, shelter, and prevention efforts. So temporary housing and shelter have been a key strategy within the community plan, garnering significant attention in recent years. However, it's important for us to recognize the nuanced and complex nature of this area. We would like to spend some more time really digging into this, what's being done and what we are seeing as a result of our efforts. I would like to now invite Catherine Kaminsky. We also call her KJ, from the Office of Supportive Housing in Santa Clara County, to walk us through what is being done now and what we are learning. KJ?
Thank you, Claudine. Can you hear me? Awesome. So first, I want to thank all of our partners who are doing this work with us, from our housing providers to our shelter staff to outreach workers. We know this work is incredibly hard, and we're grateful to be doing this work with you. So next slide, please. So I want to start just talking about a little bit about what temporary housing and shelter looks like in Santa Clara County. We know there's lots of different types of temporary housing, from different types of structures, different types of service models, and all of these have different costs. Some of our standards are universal. We want to see low barrier shelters that are client centered, that provide respite from the elements, and food and connection to resources. But how those shelters look really varies. We have some of the older, more traditional congregate shelters operating in our community. And increasingly, we have non-congregate shelter options that might look like motels and hotels or tiny homes or modular new construction. With each of those, we have different types of service models. And there's no one service model that matches a single type of structure. But the service models might look like they're resourced for basic needs, providing a bed, meals, hygiene services. And some of them may have more robust services like case management and connection to other resources. We also have some interim housing in our community that is specifically for people who have been connected to a permanent housing program, a voucher or a subsidy, and they're staying in that housing while their unit is being completed or while they're searching for their permanent apartment. And then we have some specialized models like medical respite and our partners at Valley Homeless Healthcare Program supporting folks who require that extra level of care. And I also want to mention that we have specific populations in many of these models as well. We have shelters serving families, serving vets, serving survivors of domestic violence. So how it looks varies across our community, and we're going to dive, I look forward to diving a little bit deeper in looking at these programs and the outcomes they're achieving. Next slide, please. So our system has served almost 20,000 people in temporary housing across our community since 2020. The vast majority of those are people served are single adults, but we also see a lot of families with children. You see the age breakdown. A lot of minors have been served across our system in our family programs. In 2023, we also saw that a lot of folks had multiple stays. So 41% of people staying in temporary housing had either multiple stays in the same shelter or stayed in multiple shelters. And the average amount of time in shelter for those who access this service was close to 6 months. Next slide, please. So we have a goal to double temporary housing capacity in our community, a part of our community plan, and we are making progress. We've expanded our shelter options by 44% since 2020 and have another 384 units in the pipeline. And that growth has been in lots of different types of temporary housing models, but the largest increase has been in interim housing. And interim housing doesn't mean just one thing either. We have some of the interim housing that I talked about earlier, like Willow Glen Studios or Pedro Street, Bella Vista, where folks are connected to a permanent housing program, as well as the city of San Jose's interim housing, emergency interim housing communities. And they've been a tremendous leader in expanding this capacity. Just want to take a moment too to thank some of our partners who have been able to grow with us. You know, folks like Life Moves and Home First that have been doing this work for a long time with us, and Abode, who has been working on these new interim models with the county, but also folks that are agencies that are newer and have worked to expand over just the last few years, like Path and Amigos and Covenant House. So I know I didn't get everybody, but this is a collective effort of so many agencies, so many people across our community. Next slide, please. So we know that expansion of opportunities is critical, but also is improving the way that we're operating shelters and providing services. We've made a lot of improvements locally. Some examples here on the slide. This isn't all inclusive, but our centralized shelter hotline has meant increased access and utilization, as well as more transparency of how beds how people are referred to beds. We've been able to increase hours of operations in year-round shelters. 4 years ago in South County, the Gilroy shelter, the largest shelter we have in South County, was operating only in the cold weather months overnight. but now we have been able to expand that to 24/7 year round. We also have seen most of the increase in non-congregate options, increasing privacy and comfort for those staying in temporary housing. There's more case management and peer support available at temporary housing today than there ever was in the past. And as we make these improvements, we're listening to folks with lived experience, folks who have stayed in temporary housing, folks that are trying to access temporary housing, about what they would like to see these models look like. Next slide, please. And as a result of all of these efforts, we have a much more robust and highly utilized temporary housing and shelter system today than we have in the past. We see 80 to 90% utilization rates across our temporary housing system, including a 90% utilization rate in shelter. But even with that expansion and that higher utilization, we know we still don't have enough to meet the need. Right now, in 2023, the average wait time for getting a referral to a shelter program was 30 days. And now, as I mentioned, the City of San Jose has been a leader in this effort to expand and improve temporary housing. So I want to hand it over to Reagan from the City of San Jose's Housing Department to share a bit more about their efforts.
Thanks, KJ. Since 2020, the City of San Jose has been, neck deep in interim housing, building and siting interim housing as quickly and efficiently as we can. Since 2020, we have about 15 interim sites, either complete, under construction, or in our development pipeline, which is a little over 1,200 beds. And this also includes hotels, including some home key projects, and supportive parking for RVs. And our interim housing can look very different. So top picture here is traditional emergency sleeping cabins. And then the remaining two pictures are what we call modular builds, where we purchase modular units from a manufacturer offsite and place them on the sites we've identified. All in all, next year, with all of these sites, we're projecting about a $50 million annual operating cost for next year alone. Next slide, please. So last year, our consultant, Homebase, completed a study of San Jose's interim housing at the request of the Housing Department. With COVID-19 winding down, where we had really ramped up a lot of interim housing, we thought it was a good time to pause and study how our interim housing is operating and really look at where we could do better. So Homebase interviewed participants at our current interim housing sites and also interviewed our interim housing nonprofit operators. What we found overwhelmingly is that our participants, first and foremost, really appreciated the privacy that non-congregate interim housing provided them versus a traditional congregate shelter setting. And they really viewed our interim housing place as a safe place to recover from the trauma of living unsheltered. In San Jose, all of our referrals for our interim housing sites come from San Jose's street outreach teams, who are working in some of our largest encampments. Our service providers, our partners at Life Moves, Abode, Path, and Home First, all expressed a need to have, how important it was to have resources and enough staff to care for people who are of all abilities and disabilities. And then they also just expressed how hard it is to have a healthy and strong workforce that's paid enough, A lot of people working in our nonprofits are struggling with housing insecurity in the same way that the people we're serving. And so they really expressed a need to be adequately resourced to provide interim housing, and that it is a tough business. You know, low barrier shelter is a hard business to be in. And then finally, we are looking at our long-term obligations or costs to run all of these interim housing sites, and trying to balance maintaining high outcomes of placements to permanent housing, but also managing our costs. Next slide. So in San Jose, we're really, over the next year, going to be standardizing our operations across all of our interim housing sites, incorporating the feedback of our participants that we learned through the home-based study. So things like longer stays, we're looking at 12-month stays to really allow people that time to heal and recover. Looking at resident councils as another way to have a continuous feedback loop with our customers who are actually staying at our sites, and also looking at things like visitor policies and standardizing case management ratios to really maintain that level of customer care. And then one other thing that we would like to replicate and plan to replicate at one of our interim housing sites is a partnership that we had at our Guadalupe interim housing site with the Lived Experience Advisory Board and Destination Home. We had a small work group of lead members who advised us from the planning and design of this site, but all the way through implementation and advising on our operations and services plans. And we plan to replicate this at another site we're currently under design. I think I'm handing it back to you, KJ.
Thanks, Reagan. So next we wanted to dig a little bit into the outcomes that we're seeing across our temporary housing system. And we know these outcomes are going to vary depending on who is being served, the resources available at that site, but all of them have, a basic goal to provide relief from the elements. We also want to see these programs connect people to other services and be a pathway to better meeting their needs, whether it's permanent housing or other resources. But the ultimate goal for all of us across our entire supportive housing system, whether it's outreach, drop-in center, shelters, we want to help folks obtain and maintain a permanent housing solution. Next slide, please. So I just want to pause here and also acknowledge that the way that we're presenting this information is a little bit different than we have in the past. We've always reported out in temporary housing on the permanent housing connections, exits to permanent housing. But as we talked about doing a deeper dive and really understanding what the outcomes are for folks being served across our system, we're showing things in a little bit different way and helping us see, better see what's going on for folks that are accessing temporary housing. So in this slide, this is the status for all the people who were served in temporary housing in 2023, which was about 7,400 people. We saw a wide range of outcomes for all the folks that accessed our temporary housing system last year. In terms of their status today, some of them we unfortunately don't know. 14% left shelter, and we're not sure where they went. We also unfortunately see sort of 12% return to an unsheltered situation. However, we also saw some really good outcomes. 25% of people moved into permanent housing, which is tremendous. Considering the number of people served, that's a lot of folks that moved to permanent housing. And we see that almost half, about 46%, were still in temporary housing. And that's 35% were in the same program that they were enrolled in. 11% moved to another temporary housing program, which isn't necessarily negative. Sometimes folks there's a program that better meets their needs as an individual, and they move into that program is a step in the right direction. And folks staying in shelters isn't necessarily surprising. We know a lot of folks are on fixed incomes. They need an affordable unit, and the lack of affordable units available is part of why folks are staying in temporary housing. Next slide, please. So then we wanted to look into a little bit those folks that did exit to permanent housing. How did they do so? So what do we know here? We know that the majority of people who found permanent housing were assisted by a permanent housing program. That was our emergency housing vouchers, our permanent supportive housing programs, rapid rehousing programs, or another housing subsidy. So 72% of those that exited temporary housing into permanent were assisted with some sort of subsidy. There were other folks that were able to find housing without a subsidy, and some folks were able to reconnect with family and friends. Next slide.
AJ, can I pause you there, please?
Sure.
And leave it on this slide, please. So this is a really important point here, and it seems clear to me that permanent housing is really key to the success of temporary housing. Am I right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think what we're seeing in the data is that most people do need a permanent housing program in order to connection to a permanent housing program in order to exit to a permanent apartment. So it shows that we have to keep investing in and expanding our permanent housing programs alongside this effort to improve our temporary housing system.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So we also wanted to show, this is another way of looking at a similar data set here. We're looking at outcomes from different temporary housing types. So the left column is the percent of people from each of those temporary housing types who successfully moved into permanent housing. And on the right column, we're looking at the percent of people who were served in those programs that were also enrolled in a supportive housing program. So we see the correlation here where the higher connections to supportive housing programs were correlated to where we see that there are also higher exits to permanent housing in that program type. So very similar type of outcome that we're seeing, just a different data set to confirm what we were seeing in that exit destination data. Next slide, please. And I'm almost done talking to move on to the panel. Those of you who know me know that I could talk data all day long, but I'm going to wrap it up here soon. I think, here the key takeaways are, we know temporary housing and shelter are part of the solution. They're critical part of our supportive housing system. But we also know that most people need additional support to obtain permanent housing. I also, as Reagan also acknowledged, operating and living in shelters can be difficult. So we have to continue those efforts to improve the way we're operating shelter, the way people are provided services in those shelters. And as we do that work, we have to continue listening to the people who are staying there, the people who have stayed there in the past, and the people who work in those shelters. And I'm very excited that we've made a lot of progress, but also really looking forward to what's ahead for us as a community. And I'll pass it back to Claudine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, KJ, and thank you, Reagan, for the presentation. So we have been given a wealth of information, and now it's time to further explore it with the input of our panelists. And before I introduce our panelists, I would like to remind everyone to please put your questions into the chat. I've seen some questions come up in the chat, and there will be points throughout the panel discussion and also during our audience Q&A session where we will be able to flag these questions to be answered by our panelists. All right, without further ado, you all have heard from Catherine Kaminsky, KJ. She is at the Santa Clara County Office of Supportive Housing. Reagan Henninger, whom you've also seen earlier in the presentation, is from the City of San Jose Housing Department. And we have with us Eli Soke. He is a community leader and resident of the Arena Hotel. And lastly, we have Vivian Wan, who is the CEO of Abode Services. All right, panelists, I hope you're ready for me. Our first question is going to be going to Vivian. And we will start with a discussion about your initial reactions to the information that has already been shared today. So Vivian, what are some of the things that resonated with you as a nonprofit who has been involved with providing temporary housing and shelter?
Thanks, Claudine, and thanks everyone. The first thing that comes to mind is and it sounds cheesy, but it takes a village. There's so much going on in the communities that we serve that even us as providers who we sort of know what's going on, there's so much. So it's, really being mindful of ensuring that we're creating dignity. Dignity is at the center of everything that we do. And I certainly heard that, in KJ and Reagan and of course, Claudine, and making sure that happens. That's the first thing of all of these efforts. And it's hard to see it all together, frankly, even for someone who's in the middle of it all, right? So just imagining that from the consumer perspective, right? I think that how folks access services, that we didn't talk much about that today, but the county and city have worked really, really hard to make that an easier process. The second thing is, really, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, this solving for today and tomorrow, really making sure that we have permanent solutions attached to the shelters. I know of all my staff in these shelters, nothing is harder than, even the best case managers can't actually make housing happen out of nowhere. So when housing costs average $2,900 a month, and someone is coming in making 300 or maybe 1,000, maybe 1,500, it's still not paying for that rent. So really needing that. I wish I had a magic wand where they could, but that connection to permanent housing, we feel it, we know it, and we clearly now see it in the data.
Thank you, Vivian. And now we will go over to Eli. So Eli, you have spent some time staying in various forms of temporary housing and shelter. What are some of your thoughts and maybe reactions to the information shared today?
Yeah, well, I want to thank all of you guys for including me in this panel. I do appreciate it. And that's going to be one of my key takeaways is what KJ was talking about, and including people such as myself that are going through this or have gone through this is very important, I feel. Just because everything evolves, technology evolves, it gets easier or it gets harder for people. The prices of everything continues to go up and never comes back down. So involving us, even as I transition to, the next step of my life, somebody that's going through the situation in temporary housing or even unhoused, to be able to be invited onto these type of panels, I think is important. But thank you guys again for having me on.
Awesome. Thank you, Eli. All right. So as I reflect on the presentation today by KJ, I want to come back to something that I sort of alluded to earlier from the presentation. Temporary housing and shelter sites alone cannot end homelessness. KJ, I want to come back to you. Do you agree with that sentiment? And maybe if you can talk about maybe some other key actions that we must take alongside temporary housing and shelter to find success?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Claudine. I think this is something we're looking at every day. What this data showed us today and what we're seeing is that if our ultimate goal is to help people find permanent housing, which I think we can agree across all sectors, we want folks to have a permanent place to be that is safe and that works for them. Shelter strategies alone are not going to get us there. They aren't working without permanent housing. And so we have to continue to invest in permanent housing solutions. We have to continue to invest in permanent supportive housing programs, rapid rehousing programs, developing affordable housing. And that's why the county, I can speak for our organization, is investing in all of them. So we have worked to invest in more temporary housing, but we are also driving full force as much as we can to expand our permanent housing programs and to develop more housing, and also increasing our investment in prevention. We don't want to see folks have to enter the shelter system if we can help them before they ever experience homelessness. So while it's a critical piece, we know alone it's not the answer.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much, KJ. Vivian, from your organization's experience providing temporary housing and shelter, what factors do you see as being key to helping people transition to permanent housing?
I mean, access to, it sounds silly, access to housing options, whether it's a rapid rehousing type of voucher, short-term, time limited, or permanent. I think the other thing is choice, that sometimes, you know, we all have choice in our lives, and yet sometimes we think that once we offer something to someone in one of our programs and they say, no, we don't want that, then, you know, then we get frustrated by that. From our perspective, you know, people in programs who have choice as well. It's hard when we have a system that doesn't have an infinite amount of resources. So we're always trying to balance that choice and how many options we can provide to each individual, each household. But really, it's giving housing options. Again, I don't have that magic wand to provide to increase someone's income enough to live in Santa Clara County. It's just super expensive. So so I think that's it. Also, of course, good staff, right? We want to have people working alongside, but people are so different. Some people need a lot of support and want a lot of support. Other folks, honestly, they just need affordable housing. So really being able to customize the service level with the need.
Yeah, thank you, Vivian. I really appreciate you highlighting those two things. Number one, you talked about choice, and I definitely think that ought to be a value, right? Upon which we, you know, develop principles and sort of program structures that help serve people. The number two thing too is you highlighted about staff, right? It's so important because a lot of entry-level staff that are working at these temporary housing and shelter options are people with lived experience. They're people that have journeyed through homelessness themselves, and they absolutely do need this as much support as they can to be successful in helping others, right? So, Reagan, I want to come over to you. Given the correlation between the availability of subsidized housing and successful outcomes, how does the city of San Jose balance this, or strike the balance between investing in temporary housing and shelter and its overall homelessness response?
Thanks, Claudine. It's definitely something we're wrestling with. So we do have a local measure called Measure E. That's a real estate transfer tax. And we have a spending plan for that revenue where we try and balance all the priorities, if you will, the priority to keep making investments in loans and permanent affordable housing, but also how do we keep funding our homelessness prevention system, and how do we use those resources to build interim housing and safe parking and other programs that are caring for people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness right now. So we definitely struggle with the balance, but we also try and align our homelessness spending and our programs with our community plan to end homelessness. So again, keeping that priority of building new affordable, but also knowing, you know, we have people that are suffering right now, and how can we efficiently use our resources to meet those needs as well.
Yeah, thank you, Reagan. So I'm going to use this time actually to have you respond to a question that was asked by Ray early on in the presentation. That was actually during the time when you were presenting on a couple of the slides. So related to success outcomes. So Ray's question is, what is preventing even higher utilization for temporary housing and shelter in the city of San Jose, obviously?
Yeah, it's we find that our interim housing sites that have in-suite bathrooms, whether it's a hotel or the modular construction, those are highly utilized. And if there is a lag in utilization, it typically is because a unit is offline because we're making repairs to it. We find a little bit lower utilization in our emergency sleeping cabins. And those are the tiny little cabins, and they do not have their own bathroom. It's a shared bathroom. So our utilization rates are very high. I think across all of our units right now, we have about 20 units across all 15 sites that are not occupied. And it's due to like maintenance and repair issues. I'll maybe let KJ speak to utilization around some other programs that are in San Jose that might have a lower utilization.
Yeah. Thanks, Reagan. I'm actually, if you don't mind, many of you may know my colleague, Michelle Covert, who truly is the expert in this area and has been doing this work for much longer than I have, specifically with regard to temporary housing and the challenges and opportunities that we see. And if I could ask her to chime in here, I think she may have the most knowledge on this one.
Thanks, KJ. I better sound really smart now. Can you guys hear me okay? So I will say, the utilization ranges, our utilization of our single adult facilities with same day intakes is ranging about 95, 96% utilization. And it's more so the family programs and some of the safe parking programs where families are called. And sometimes it takes a little bit longer to reach them, schedule an intake. And we want to be mindful of that. If a family's been waiting for an emergency shelter for, 3 to 4 weeks, we don't want to just give them 12 to 14 hours to call or a day to call back and make that appointment. So there is often sometimes a little bit of a lag between calling the family and then being able to make the arrangements to get to their intake appointment. So it's a balancing act that happens between the centralized Here For You call center, the shelters, and then giving the time for the individual or household to make it for their appointment. And if they don't make it for an appointment, we don't want to automatically cancel their opportunity for shelter and put them back on the waiting list. So that creates a little bit of a lag. We do our best, but the shelters don't want to call more people than they can accommodate, especially when they have children.
Yes, thank you so much to all of you for responding to that question. All right, let's pivot and talk about cost. There's been a lot of public attention given to the costs of various homelessness programs, and in particular, the relative cost effectiveness of temporary housing and shelter. But I know the truth is a little bit more nuanced. KJ, can you talk a little bit about the costs of building and operating temporary housing and shelter, and maybe both the challenges and opportunities that creates?
Sure. Thanks, Claudine. So, unfortunately,
We'll give her a second to pop back in, hopefully.
Katie's in LA somewhere, so.
Let me see. Let's come back to KJ. Reagan, I'm going to move over to you, and then we'll go back to KJ. So Reagan, we've seen San Jose confront these financial realities themselves. In fact, recent estimates from the city manager's office are that temporary housing and shelter costs could reach 70 million annually in the next few years. So what kind of challenge does this present for the city?
Thanks, Claudine. Yeah, I think in about 5 years, when we've you know, built all the interim housing that's still in our under construction and in our pipeline, uh, we'll have we won't have enough housing and homeless related sources to pay to cover all of the interim housing costs. So that includes our local Measure E source, state money, federal money that are all dedicated towards homeless solutions. The cost will actually be greater than that, and so we'll need to rely on the general fund. And in about 5 years, we'll need a general fund contribution of somewhere near $70 million to continue operating our interim housing. So it's a real, um, I will say, it's an opportunity to get creative on how we fund the services. So, for example, looking at the Willow Glen Studios model, where we'll have a partnership with the Office of Supportive Housing and the Santa Clara County Housing Authority, um, to help fund operations. We're also looking at other state sources like new CalA money that's coming through our local managed care plans. So we're trying to braid together some creative sources, but it's definitely a fiscal challenge, and definitely highlights how advocacy at the state and federal level is also super important. So, for example, making a state funding source called the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Fund, or HAP money, an ongoing source of money. The city gets about $29 million from that source, but it is a one-time source. So making things like that ongoing rather than one time could really help local entities like us implement these solutions.
All right, thank you, Reagan. KJ, looks like you're back with us. Did you want to finish your response?
Yes, sorry about that. Technical difficulties, but and I missed some of what Reagan said, so apologies if I am repetitive here, but I think, what we do know is that while some temporary housing may be quicker, and overall per unit cost may be less in the short term, we also know that operating temporary housing is generally more costly than operating permanent housing. The cost per household per year in those long-term operating costs is more than it is for our permanent housing programs. So, when we are in a environment where we're looking at resources and how to allocate, there are trade-offs. And so we have to look at, I think, again, just what are the goals of the community? What are our ultimate goals for people experiencing homelessness, and make sure that we're investing in all parts of the system, because the needs are so varied and so broad.
Yeah, thank you so much. So our community actually has been at the forefront of integrating lived experience into the process of creating temporary housing and shelter sites. Eli, I'm going to come to you with this next one. We'd love to hear your perspective as well, as someone who has spent some time in temporary housing and shelter options. What are some of the things you'd like to see replicated or improved in future sites? And what are your thoughts on how residents can be engaged in that process?
Um, yeah, some of my thoughts. Well, I would have to say the support of staff. The support of staff is something that was it was enlightening to me. Um, there's a lot of staff in the temporary shelters. There needs to be a lot of staff because a lot of people need a lot of different help. First, we have the case managers, we have their supervisors, then we have the housing management, those that help us with the counseling, job searches, those type of case managers, and each one has a different department. So as a resident, I have all these resources available to me, um, and I know that when you guys talk numbers, it seems like a lot to the community to invest what 70 million, but we got to think about, well, how much does it cost for you to live? That's how much it costs for me to live. I am living off of GA. That means I only make $150 a month. That's it. I don't have anything else. And I may look well-bodied, but I am disabled. Um, so those costs we need to consider. Involving us in these type of things is good also. Um, those those are just my thoughts on your question right now. I'll have more later, but that's for right now.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Eli and Reagan. Just very quickly, so you've been very involved in this work at the City of San Jose. Can you share any significant differences in sites that have been developed with people with lived experience and those that have not?
Yeah, there's some subtle differences and also some not so subtle differences. So in the Guadalupe site that involved our lived experience working group, the site there is designed so colorful and cheerful, compared to a site that did not have the lived experience group advising on the design, where it's kind of boring, basic San Jose tans and browns. So simple things like that really make a difference. You know, when you come on to Guadalupe EIH, you get an immediate, you're hit with the color and the designs, and you really get a sense of happiness with the color. Also, that site does not have security. So it does have controlled site access to make sure the community is safe, but you're not met with, it doesn't feel like a security fortress where you're met with a uniformed guard, for example, which I think makes a difference when you're coming on site. So those are a few of the examples of what incorporating the expertise and consultancy of people who have experienced homelessness makes a really big difference in the site.
All right, thank you so much, Reagan. So now we're going to close out the panel discussion and go right into Q&A. We already have a lot of questions in the chat, and I'm going to invite my colleague Esmeralda to assist us with the questions.
Hey, Claudine, we have one question about data and what do we know from the data about why people are falling into homelessness and some of the causes?
Let's go to KJ first with that one. KJ?
Yeah, so what we see, and there's a few data points that we use to really look at this, the causes of folks becoming unhoused. And one of them is the survey that we do with the point in time count. That's every couple of years. We also look at, through our prevention system, we collect data about why people are at risk of homelessness, why they're coming to ask for help. And the vast majority, the top answers there are financial related. It's a loss of income, loss of job, increase in rent that makes the unit that was maybe just barely affordable is now not affordable anymore. We also see a divorce or separation, as well as folks fleeing domestic violence as some of the primary reasons why people show up requesting prevention assistance. And also some of the top reasons we see through our point in time count survey year after year that has not changed much in the last 10 years that we've been doing this. The financial reality is that many folks are struggling, and one paycheck or medical event or something, some event that takes, unfortunately, pushes them into homelessness.
We have another question from a community member to Reagan, I believe, about safe parking. Is the city doing anything to waive smog or registration requirements to help get people into safe parking programs?
Thank you. So as a city bureaucrat, I can say that, this government does not make things easy a lot of times, right? So at our current RV safe parking site, we're leasing that from another public entity, the Valley Transportation Authority. And they have required that we comply with state law for vehicles, which means you have to have registration and insurance, right? I have to have vehicle registration and insurance. So they made that a requirement, which I understand why, but unfortunately that can be a barrier for many people to participate, whether they don't have the money for insurance, or even a simple thing like registering your car. You have to show proof of ownership. And even that can be a barrier if you inherited a vehicle from a family member, let's say, but you don't have the paperwork to prove it. Those can be real hurdles to participating. And so we are currently in the process of the city taking on more liability and risk, and amending our lease agreement with VTA so that we take on that risk, and not have those requirements. So removing those barriers. So it is in process.
Thank you, Reagan. And another one from Chuck. How many beds are available for youth 16 to 24 in any of your systems? And are they separate or are they grouped with adults?
I don't have the number off the top of my head, but if I could maybe ask Michelle again to talk a little bit about what the youth and young adult programs in our system look like. Not expecting her to have the number of units memorized either, but we could follow up with that. But maybe Michelle, can you speak to a little bit about what the pay and minor shelter programs look like?
Sure. Thanks for unmuting me again. To the best of my ability, the young adult shelter capacity for 12 to 17-year-olds operated by Bill Wilson Center is 20 beds. So the age range for youth services is minors are referred to the safety net shelter operated by Bill Wilson. Again, that's 20 beds. And then transitional age youth 18 to 24, there are emergency shelters, overnight respite programs, and transitional housing. So off the top of my head, is roughly 30 beds of young adult shelter, and roughly about 60 units of transitional housing. But we could, like I said, verify those numbers. But they are two different age ranges. So you're not having transition age youth 18 to 24 in a facility with youth 17 and younger.
And those programs are really, oh, go ahead, Michelle.
I was going to say, our partners, there might be some partners on the call that maybe could put that in the chat. If there's anybody here from Covenant House or Bill Wilson Center, that'd be great.
Just one other thing to add, yet most of the youth and young adult programs that are specific to youth and young adults are operated separately and sort of tailored to the needs of folks, but youth and young adults are also served across our temporary housing system, 18 and older. I will say, like, the transition age youth are served across our housing system. Many are served in other shelters. Many have children and are served in our family shelters as well. So while there are youth and young adult specific programs, those are not the only places that are available. They can also access services across the rest of the support housing system.
Thank you. And the next one, on an average, how long is it taking to temporarily house a family?
So one of the data points we shared in the, I'm sorry if I'm just jumping in here. You didn't call on me, but
You're good.
Maybe assuming, okay. You know, one of the data points we showed that in the slides was that the average last year was 30 days across the system. And so for families, I believe that has been a little bit longer in the recent months, more like 6 to 8 weeks for a referral to a family shelter bed, but it varies greatly at each month, depending on what's available and what's happening in terms of expansion. New programs come online, a program adds 30 beds, and referrals may go much quicker in that period of time. Winter months may be longer because more people are seeking shelter in the winter months. So there is some variation, but it is, you know, unfortunately, we don't have enough resources right now where everyone's getting a referral immediately. But folks will get referrals if they are requesting assistance. Within a few months.
Esme, do we have time for one more?
I think we can do one more.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's go to, what is the projected lifetime of emergency interim housing units?
Reagan, that's yours.
Yeah. It depends on the type, right? So modular construction, typically 10 to 15 years. You know, a hotel has a much longer life than that. So it really kind of depends on the type. And for safe parking, you know, it's just it's our lease for the parking lot. So really depends on the type of interim unit that you're talking about.
Yes, thank you so much, Reagan. I know there's still a lot of questions in the chat, but these things happen, right? When we're talking about critical issues, time goes by so quickly. So right now, we're going to be closing. But before we do that, I would like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to share a key takeaway that you want people to take away from this discussion today. So Reagan, I'll go back to you.
Key takeaway, I would say, is how important it is to incorporate people who have experienced homelessness across our interim housing. It is because there's so many different types and forms and it's not standardized. I think at every opportunity we should be incorporating that experience.
Absolutely. All right, KJ.
Thanks, Claudine. Yeah, I think my key takeaway is that we have to keep moving on all fronts in terms of interventions. That temporary housing is folks in the temporary housing system are doing great work, but we also have to keep expanding our permanent housing programs and our prevention programs as well. And I will just take this moment, since you gave me a little air too, that I forgot to, you know, one of the challenges when we are expanding temporary housing is community support. And so I want to just shout out to neighbors who have been supportive of these programs and these projects. In addition to people with lived experience, I think the folks living in the neighborhood are critical to making sure we're successful in this effort. So thank you to all the partners, and that was one that I inadvertently left out and wanted to make sure I got to say that. Appreciate it.
Yes, very important. Thank you, KJ. And with that, I'll go over to Vivian.
Yeah, like KJ, that you know, I think that it really illuminates that we need all of these tools, you know, in our toolbox. We need a bigger toolbox, right? So, and I think that we need to probably be more intentional about how the tools connect, right? You know, how housing connects to each one of those. And there's lots of questions about rapid rehousing. I think that's a whole nother webinar, but yeah, lots of tools, and then intentionality around the connections of those tools.
Yeah. All right. Last but not least, Eli.
Again, thank you guys all. I would just like to point out the necessity of involving people like me and others into this. I want to thank everybody that's on this panel. The community must know that the people that are working behind the scenes that you don't see are very important. As everybody on this panel and their staff, very important for us to support those people. The community doesn't need to fear homelessness, doesn't need to fear the homeless man or woman in their community coming to park on their street. We're not there to do anything other than to live and to sleep somewhere safely. I don't want to talk for other people, but for myself, I know that I'm not coming around trying to hurt anybody. I'm just trying to get back on my feet like everybody else. Again, thank you guys all. The transition coming from living in my car into the Arena Hotel has been such a boost of my self-confidence, and I'm grateful for that. I'm looking forward to the next stage. But again, thank you guys all for having me on, and thank you for hearing me out.
So amazing. And thank you so much, Eli, for ending us on that sentiment. So I would like to thank all of our panelists for their participation on the panel. And also I want to offer a special thank you to all of you who were able to join us today. You can access the recording from today's briefing on the destinationhomesv.org website once it's been uploaded, and the link is being shared on the chat with other informational resources. Have an amazing weekend. Thank you so much.